The story begins with tension thick in the air on Maplewood Lane. It was one of those late afternoons when the golden sun made the suburban street look peaceful, kids' bicycles leaning on fences, flower beds perfectly trimmed, the faint hum of sprinklers echoing in the background. But right in the middle of this picture-perfect neighborhood stood a standoff that was anything but peaceful. At the foot of James Carter's driveway, a woman stood with her chin tilted high, her eyes narrowed like she was preparing for battle. She was in her mid-50s, with short, precisely styled blonde hair that seemed to match her rigid personality. She wore a chocolate-brown pancoat, buttoned all the way up even though the weather was warm, as if the fabric itself were part of her armor. Her lips were pressed so tightly together they nearly disappeared, her brows drawn sharply downward, arms crossed over her chest, clipboard tucked firmly against her side. She radiated authority, or at least the illusion of it. Everyone in the neighborhood knew who she was. To some, she was simply the HOA president. To others, she was the woman who never let anything slide, the one who patrolled Maplewood Lane like a hawk circling its prey. But behind closed doors, when neighbors whispered in hushed tones, they called her something else, HOA Karen. And true to her reputation, she was here for battle. Her target that day was James Carter, a respected black veteran in his early 60s. James had always been well regarded in the neighborhood. He was polite, greeted everyone with a nod or a smile, and even after retiring from service, he was known for keeping his lawn neat and his home in perfect condition. But after a recent surgery left him wheelchair-bound, James had made one simple addition to his property, a wooden ramp leading from his front porch down to the driveway. To him, it wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Without it, he couldn't even enter or exit his own home. But to Karen, the ramp was an eyesore. She had marched over that day with purpose. The click of her low heels echoing against the pavement. Without even greeting him, she planted herself firmly in front of the ramp as if she were blocking the path of something dangerous. She flipped open her clipboard dramatically, the papers fluttering in the breeze, and leveled her gaze at James, who was sitting in his wheelchair near the porch. "You have exactly 1 week to take it down," she declared, her voice sharp enough to cut through the summer air. James blinked at her, stunned. "Excuse me?" His tone wasn't angry, just incredulous. "The ramp," Karen said, jabbing her pen toward it as if the wooden boards were a personal insult. "It violates HOA regulations. This is a neighborhood of charm and uniformity. We can't have structures like that lowering property values." Her words hung heavy in the air. James let out a short, humorless laugh. "This isn't some garden gnome or a lawn ornament you don't like. It's a wheelchair ramp. It's how I get inside my home." Karen wasn't moved. She clicked her pen, scribbled something on the papers in her clipboard, and looked back up at him with that same icy stare. "The rules apply to everyone, no exceptions." Behind the curtains of nearby houses, silhouettes shifted. Neighbors were watching. They always watched when Karen was on the prowl. Some peeked nervously, not wanting to get caught. Others leaned closer, hungry for the drama. It wasn't every day someone stood up to her. James, however, wasn't yelling or pleading. His voice was steady, calm, the way a man speaks when he's faced far worse than a woman with a clipboard. "Karen," he said firmly, "I served my country for decades. I fought to protect the rights of people like you to live peacefully in your homes. And now you're telling me I don't have the right to even enter mine." Karen's lips twitched, but she didn't back down. She thrust the paper toward him. "This is your official warning. If the ramp isn't gone in 1 week, you'll be fined $200 a day. And trust me, Mr. Carter, the HOA always collects." James's eyes darkened, but he didn't say another word. He simply looked at her, holding her gaze with a quiet strength that made even Karen falter for half a second. But pride was her fuel, and she quickly straightened again, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of a car door closing down the street. Somewhere, a dog barked. The normal sounds of suburbia contrasted sharply with the storm brewing on James's driveway. Karen tucked her clipboard under her arm and turned on her heel. 1 week, she repeated, her voice carrying through the air like a warning bell. She marched away, her heels clicking like gunshots against the pavement, her short blonde hair bobbing with each step. James exhaled slowly, gripping the arms of his wheelchair tightly. He had faced enemies on battlefields oceans away, but this was something he had never expected. His fight now wasn't for his country, it was for his dignity, his independence, and his home. And as Karen disappeared down the street, neighbors quietly pulled back from their windows, whispering behind closed doors. They all knew one thing: Maplewood Lane had just become a battlefield, and this was only the beginning. Over the next few days, the quiet rhythm of Maplewood Lane turned into a slow-burn battlefield. What had begun as a tense confrontation quickly escalated into something darker, more invasive. Karen wasn't just angry about the ramp, she made it her personal mission to see it destroyed. She began appearing at odd hours, her presence lingering like a shadow that James could never quite escape. At dawn, when the street was barely awake, James would hear the faint click, click, click of her phone camera as she snapped photos of the ramp from every possible angle. At dusk, she returned, circling the driveway like a vulture, muttering under her breath to dog-walking neighbors about how the unsightly structure was bringing down property values. Every whispered complaint, every sideways glance, was carefully orchestrated to stir resentment in the community. Then came the letters. One morning, James found a crisp white envelope slid under his door, the HOA seal stamped in dark ink across the top. Inside, the words were cold, clinical, and threatening. Notice of violation. Homeowner James Carter. Installation of unauthorized structure in violation of Section 4, Paragraph B. Failure to comply will result in fines of $200 per day until removal is completed. James held the letter in his hands, his jaw tightening. He had once held military briefings filled with details of combat missions, enemy movements, and high-stakes orders. But now, here he was, staring at a letter from his own neighborhood association, telling him that his right to enter his home carried a daily price tag, and it wasn't just one letter. Day after day, the envelopes kept coming, each one slipped under his door, stacked on his entry table like a pile of insults. Karen made sure the HOA's seal was visible, as though the stamp itself carried authority greater than the Constitution. James, a man who had faced enemy fire, couldn't believe he was now fighting for the simple right to roll up his own ramp. Some of his neighbors noticed what was happening. Mrs. Lopez, who lived across the street, quietly stopped James one afternoon as he made his way down the ramp to collect his mail. "James," she whispered, glancing nervously toward Karen's house. "I'm so sorry for what she's doing. It isn't right." But as quickly as she spoke, she lowered her eyes, clutching her grocery bag tighter, and hurried away. Sympathy existed, yes, but courage was in short supply. Others whispered their support in passing, always looking over their shoulders as though Karen's watchful eyes might catch them in the act of kindness. Fear of HOA retaliation kept them silent, and silence, James knew, was a form of complicity. Karen, meanwhile, grew bolder with each passing day. One morning, James rolled out to his mailbox only to find Karen waiting at the base of the ramp. Stood tall, her chocolate brown coat buttoned neatly, her short blonde hair gleaming in the sunlight as if the entire scene were staged. In her hand was her phone, recording every movement he made. "This is all documented," she sneered, her voice sharp and triumphant. "Every violation, every refusal. And when the HOA board meets, you'll regret ignoring me." The audacity of her words stung. James paused halfway down the ramp, staring at her through narrowed eyes. He had seen intimidation before. He knew what it looked like when someone tried to crush another's spirit through relentless pressure. But this wasn't a war zone or a battlefield. This was his home, his sanctuary, and still, she stood there, holding her phone like it was a weapon, daring him to challenge her authority. James's heart burned with anger, but beneath the anger was something deeper: resolve. He thought of the sacrifices he had made, the years he had given in service, the scars he carried both seen and unseen, and now, this woman, this self-appointed enforcer of community standards, was trying to strip away his dignity with a clipboard, a phone, and an inflated sense of power. He could have shouted, he could have argued, but instead, he sat there, steady as a rock, letting the silence stretch long enough to make Karen shift uncomfortably. In that silence, James made a decision. He wasn't going to let her bully him into submission. He wasn't going to quietly pay fines or tear down the ramp that gave him freedom. He had fought too many battles to give in to someone like her. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. And as she finally clicked off her camera and turned away with a huff, James knew the battle lines had been drawn. This wasn't just about a ramp anymore. It was about dignity, justice, and the principle that no one, not even an HOA president, with a stern face and a brown coat, had the right to deny him access to his own home. The war for Maplewood Lane had officially begun. James knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. After the endless warnings, the threats of fines, and the humiliating surveillance, he reached out for help. One phone call connected him to the local disability rights group, and within hours, he was sitting across from two advocates at his kitchen table. They listened patiently as James described Karen's harassment, the letters, and the absurd demand to remove the very ramp that gave him access to his home. The lead advocate, a woman named Michelle, leaned forward, her voice firm and certain. "She can't do this to you," she said. "The Americans with Disabilities Act protects your right to reasonable accessibility modifications. A wheelchair ramp is not optional, it's essential." For the first time in weeks, James felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't just a man up against a clipboard-wielding tyrant. He had the law on his side. Michelle and her team wasted no time. They began drafting a formal complaint, citing specific federal accessibility laws that Karen and the HOA were blatantly ignoring. With every line typed, James felt the tide shifting. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for countless others who might be bullied into silence. But while James was quietly building his defense, Karen was plotting her counterattack. She called an emergency HOA meeting, summoning the board members and a handful of loyal supporters to the neighborhood clubhouse. The room smelled faintly of coffee and copier paper, but Karen treated it like a courtroom. Standing tall in her sharp chocolate brown coat, She spoke with the dramatic flair of someone who believed every word was gospel. "This ramp," she began, her voice loud and commanding, "is a threat to the charm of our community. Maplewood Lane has always prided itself on uniformity, order, and beauty. If we allow one violation, what comes next? Shoddy sheds, neon paint jobs, broken down cars and driveways? We must protect our neighborhood before it's too late." A few board members nodded, more out of habit than conviction. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone knew Karen had a way of steamrolling through meetings with her fiery speeches, but this time felt different. There was a nervous undercurrent in the room, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she had picked the wrong fight. Still, Karen clung to her authority. She waved documents in the air, highlighting sections of bylaws that vaguely mentioned unapproved exterior modifications. Her words tumbled out like bullets, rapid and relentless, leaving little room for anyone else to interject. Meanwhile, James was preparing for the very same meeting. When the day arrived, the community room was unusually packed. Neighbors who rarely attended sat in folding chairs along the back wall, curious to witness the showdown. Whispers filled the air. Some whispered support for James. Others speculated nervously about whether the HOA could really force him to tear down the ramp. Karen stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand, already scowling. But this time, James wasn't walking in alone. He rolled through the doorway in his wheelchair, flanked by Michelle and two other disability rights advocates. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Heads turned. The whispers grew louder. Even Karen's expression faltered for a brief second before she quickly hardened her gaze again. James wheeled himself to the front, positioning his chair so he was eye-to-eye with the crowd. He didn't need theatrics. He didn't need a booming voice. His presence alone commanded attention. "This ramp," he began, his voice calm but steady, "isn't about appearances. It's about survival. Without it, I can't enter my home. Without it, I lose the freedom to live independently. And after serving my country, after giving decades of my life to protect the rights of others, I will not stand by while someone strips me of my own." The room fell silent. Even the air seemed to pause, holding the weight of his words. James continued, his tone measured but powerful. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever needed a ramp, a railing, or a simple accommodation to live with dignity. No bylaw, no rulebook, no clipboard should ever take precedence over a person's right to exist freely in their own home." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few neighbors nodded openly now. Mrs. Lopez dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Even some of Karen's most loyal allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Karen, however, refused to surrender. Her cheeks flushed, and she clutched her clipboard like a shield. "Rules are rules," she snapped, her voice shrill. "If we make one exception, it opens the floodgates. We must think about the community, about property values." But her words rang hollow in the wake of James's testimony, where his voice carried dignity and truth. Hers sounded petty and desperate. Michelle stood beside James, stepping forward. "For the record," she said firmly, "this HOA is in direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. If this harassment continues, we will not hesitate to pursue legal action at the state and federal level." A hush swept the room. The board members looked at each other, suddenly realizing this was no longer a neighborhood squabble, was a legal minefield. And though Karen kept her stern face fixed, deep down she knew the ground beneath her was crumbling. For the first time, her iron grip on the neighborhood seemed to falter. What she didn't know was that the battle had already moved beyond Maplewood Lane. James and his advocates had taken the matter further, and the fight was now larger than Karen's clipboard, larger than the HOA, and larger than her ego could contain. The turning point had arrived, and Karen was on the losing side. Word of the dispute didn't just stay within Maplewood Lane, it spread like wildfire. What started as whispers between neighbors soon turned into headlines. A local reporter picked up the story after seeing posts on social media, and within days, TV vans were parked along the curb. Cameras pointed at James's wooden ramp as though it were the symbol of a larger battle. Reporters interviewed neighbors, capturing a split in the community. Some nervously repeated Karen's talking points about neighborhood charm and property values. But most spoke with sympathy for James. "He's a veteran," one young father told the camera. "He served this country, and now he has to fight just to get inside his own house? It's ridiculous." Every evening news segment showed the same shot. James wheeling down his ramp with quiet dignity, while Karen stood in the background, arms crossed, lips pursed, glaring like a villain caught mid. Karen hated it. She despised the news crews cluttering her perfect neighborhood, hated the sound of microphones being thrust forward, and above all, she hated that the spotlight wasn't hers to control. But her pride wouldn't allow her to back down. Every time a reporter tried to question her, she snapped into her usual rehearsed speeches. "This is not personal," she said into the cameras, her voice tight. "It's about protecting property values. If we allow one violation, we open the door to chaos." But the more she spoke, the more foolish she sounded. Her carefully cultivated authority now looked petty under the harsh glare of the media. And then came the moment that shifted everything. That it was a bright Tuesday morning when the atmosphere on Maplewood Lane changed forever. The sound of engines rumbled down the street. and a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled to a stop in front of James's home. The doors opened, and out stepped the governor himself, flanked by 2 aides and a cluster of state troopers. The neighborhood gasped. Reporters scrambled into position, cameras flashing like fireworks. Neighbors poured out of their houses, standing shoulder to shoulder on lawns and driveways to witness what was happening. For once, everyone's attention was fixed, not on Karen, but on James. The governor walked directly toward James, who sat waiting on his porch in his wheelchair. His posture was straight, his hands steady, though his eyes betrayed a mix of surprise and gratitude. The 2 men clasped hands firmly, the handshake lingering, as the governor leaned closer and said something quietly to him. Then, turning to the cameras, the governor raised his voice so all could hear. "No one," he declared, his words booming across Maplewood Lane, "should ever be punished for making their home accessible. This man fought for our freedoms. The least we can do is ensure he has his own." The crowd erupted, cheers, applause, even tears from some of the neighbors who had felt powerless until that moment. Mrs. Lopez clapped loudly, tears streaming down her cheeks, while children waved small American flags someone had handed out. Reporters leaned forward eagerly, their microphones pointed like spears, capturing every word. James felt a wave of validation wash over him. After weeks of being treated like a nuisance in his own community, here was the highest authority in the state standing beside him, affirming his dignity. His ramp was no longer just a wooden structure, it was a symbol of justice, of rights that could not be trampled by arrogance. And then there was Karen. She stood just a few feet away, frozen in disbelief. Her short blonde hair seemed to glint too brightly under the camera lights, her chocolate brown coat suddenly looking less like a badge of authority and more like a costume. Her stern expression, the one that had once intimidated her neighbors into silence, now looked ridiculous, an empty mask cracking under the weight of statewide attention. The governor didn't acknowledge her. He didn't need to. Every camera in the crowd swung in her direction, capturing the pale look on her face, the way she clutched her clipboard like a lifeline. She tried to hold her head high, but the confidence that once fueled her was gone. For the first time in her reign as HOA president, she wasn't in control. Reporters called out to her, "Ms. Karen, do you still believe the ramp violates HOA rules? Do you think property values matter more than accessibility rights?" Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The neighborhood she once ruled with fear was now staring at her with judgment. Some neighbors shook their heads in disgust, others openly glared. She looked small, cornered, and powerless. Meanwhile, the governor placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder and spoke again, this time directly to the people gathered. "This community should be proud," he said, "not because of rules and regulations, but because of the people who live here. People like James Carter, who gave so much for all of us, deserve nothing less than respect and accessibility in their homes. And let me be clear, this ramp stays." The cheers that followed were thunderous, echoing down the block. Neighbors who had been too afraid to show support now clapped openly, some even stepping forward to shake James's hand. For the first time in a long while, Maplewood Lane felt united not under fear, but under justice. And, as the governor's words replayed across every news station that evening, one thing was undeniable: the battle was over. James had won. Karen, however, had lost something far greater than a fight. She had lost her authority, her credibility, and the respect of the very people she claimed to represent. Within just a few days of the governor's visit, James's story was everywhere on television, in newspapers, trending across social media. Clips of the governor shaking James's hand played on repeat, while snapshots of Karen, standing stiffly in her brown coat with her signature scowl, quickly turned into memes. The internet labeled her HOA Karen, and the name stuck like glue. The governor wasted no time turning the moment into meaningful change. At a press conference, he announced new initiatives designed to protect homeowners with disabilities from HOA harassment. "No one," he said, "should ever have to fight for the right to enter their own home. We will make sure of that." And with James's story as the rallying cry, new legislation was drafted that strengthened accessibility rights at the community level. James had gone from being a quiet veteran on Maplewood Lane to a symbol of justice for countless families across the state. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, the HOA crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Letters poured in, news outlets kept calling, state officials started poking around. The HOA board, terrified of lawsuits and desperate to salvage their reputation, quickly distanced themselves from Karen. In a hastily organized meeting, they voted to remove her as president, the woman who had once strutted through Maplewood like a queen stripped of her crown, and it showed. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear of her clipboard now spoke openly, criticizing her arrogance and cruelty. Some admitted that they had only stayed silent because they were scared of being fined or targeted. Others expressed regret for not standing up sooner. "James did what we all should have done," Mrs. Lopez said. "He reminded us that this neighborhood belongs to the people, not the HOA. As for James, his ramp stayed right where it belonged, firmly in place. But it no longer stood as just a simple structure of wood and nails. Neighbors decorated it with flowers, small American flags, and handwritten notes of thanks. What Karen had once labeled an eyesore had become the heart of Maplewood Lane, a symbol of resilience and dignity. One evening, James sat quietly on his porch, the sun setting in hues of gold and orange, casting warm light across the ramp. He watched as children played on the sidewalk, neighbors waved to each other, and laughter echoed down the street. For once, he felt something he hadn't. In weeks' peace, the neighborhood was finally united, not under the tyranny of HOA rules, not under fear of fines or threats, but under a shared understanding of justice. They had stood together, and in doing so, they had reclaimed their community. Karen, however, was seen less and less. Every now and then, she'd appear in her brown coat, walking briskly to her car, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Without her authority, she had no audience for her theatrics, no power to wield. She had become a ghost of the very presence that once terrorized the block. James, on the other hand, had gained far more than a ramp. He had restored his dignity, secured his freedom, and inspired countless others who saw his story unfold. His fight had proven that real strength isn't in rules or regulations, it's in people standing up for what is right, that in the end, it wasn't HOA bylaws that defined Maplewood Lane. It was the people who lived there. People who had finally found their voices. People who had learned that when one neighbor stands tall, or in James's case, rolls proudly forward, everyone else has the power to follow.